Welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we get started, just a quick note to our listeners that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show or even leaving a positive review. It really does help sustain our work. And if you'd like to explore all the other topics we've covered in the past, you can find a full archive of the show at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. During his campaign for the presidency last year, Joe Biden pledged to reverse what he called, quote, the failed Trump policies toward Cuba. But now, Biden's White House is signaling that it is in no hurry to lift the severe sanctions and other measures imposed on Cuba by Trump, much less return to the historic détente with Cuba that was pioneered by Biden's old boss, former President Barack Obama. At a press briefing in mid-April, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that a policy shift on Cuba is, quote, currently not among the president's top foreign policy priorities. As the Biden administration bides its time, Cuba's aging leaders have passed the baton to a new generation. At the Cuban Communist Party's 8th Party Congress last month, Raul Castro stepped down as leader of the party, handing the reins to President Miguel Diaz-Canel and marking a transition of power to a new generation of leaders born after the 1959 revolution that swept Raul's brother Fidel Castro to power. But this changing of the guard did not appear to entail any major changes in the island's political system or its heavy-handed approach to dissent. This raises the question of whether there will continue to be a disconnect with the Biden administration, which has opted to place an emphasis on human rights in its foreign policy. Today on Trendlines, we'll be talking about Cuba and the outlook for its relationship with the U.S. under the Biden administration. I'm very happy to have as my guest for this discussion Michael Bustamante, an assistant professor of Latin American history at Florida International University, where he specializes in modern Cuba and Cuban America. His latest book, just published in March, is Cuban Memory Wars: Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile. Michael, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks, Elliot, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
At the Communist Party Congress in Cuba last month, the keyword was continuity. It appeared in speeches and social media hashtags and almost seemed calculated to send a message, perhaps aimed partly at the United States, that Cuba is not going to change. It's also notable that the Congress took place on the 60th anniversary of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. What was your read on the messaging coming out of the Congress?
Yeah, it's a good observation, Elliot. It bears mentioning that sort of this slogan of continuity is not new to this party Congress. It has been sort of part and parcel of the public presentation of Miguel Diaz-Canel ever since he was first designated head of state back in 2018. So there's been this kind of protracted generational transition of power, first at the level of government and now finally sort of catching up in terms of the leadership of the Cuban Communist Party. And Miguel Diaz-Canel has, sort of his administration, one of their watchwords all along has been this hashtag, somos continuidad, we are continuity. And it's quite clear that has been intended to telegraph a message both to the island's population and to the outside world that, and perhaps to some elements of the Cuban government itself, that the new generation being tapped for leadership does not propose any dramatic ruptures in terms of the island's political system or political message. As I was saying, I think that's a message that has multiple audiences. I think it's a message that's being sent to the outside world. Particularly to the United States, we will deal with the U.S. government on sort of terms of respecting one another's sovereignty, but our internal politics are our internal politics, and we're not budging. But I also think there's a message inside Cuba, right? To the extent that there has been a lot of commentary inside and outside the island about whether a new generation of leadership will represent or raise certain prospects for political change of one kind or another. They're clearly sending a message that that's not the case. And so this party Congress, when that generational transition in leadership has been completed, so to speak, it's no surprise to me that they have made that slogan sort of the bread and butter of the rhetoric around what they were doing.
There's also, at the same time, a rise of sort of a new protest movement. I'm not sure if that's the best term to use, but the San Isidro movement in Cuba. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that might have played into this message of continuity?
Sure. I think it's important to contextualize San Isidro against a little bit of a wider backdrop and more recent history. I think one of the interesting things over the past, call it 10 years, has been a real diversification of sort of voices in Cuban civil society that really run the gamut in terms of issues that they're interested in and also their political position vis-a-vis the Cuban state. Cuban civil society is not made up anymore of, simply folks who self-identify as opposition to the government, although that is certainly part of it. There's this very interesting middle ground, right? But to the extent that the Cuban state, also over the past 10 years, hasn't really treated more sort of middle of the road reformist voices with as much of an open mind as I think many hoped, that has had the effect of, in fact, over time, pushing some of those initially moderate voices into a more oppositional camp. And so what we've seen over the past few months is really, I think, a culmination of that kind of a process combined with the exigencies of this particular moment in Cuba. Cuba's in the midst of its worst economic crisis in 30 years. That is made worse by the Trump administration sanctions, which remain in place. But obviously, COVID was the straw that broke the camel's back for an economy so dependent on tourism. And so things in Cuba are really bad. And with the economic situation deteriorating, there's a palpable sort of sense of rising political frustration, at least on the part of many in Cuban society. So the San Isidro movement, I would say, is sort of one expression of all of that. The San Isidro movement was born in a couple years ago in response to a couple of Cuban government decrees that had to do with sort of regulating cultural production in the country in ways that were perceived by many Cuban artists as being sort of reaffirming state control over cultural production. And the San Isidro movement is a small, loose collective of artists, activists that galvanized in opposition to those measures. What's happened over the past few months, though, is that really there has just been a kind of ramping up of tension between them and forces of the Cuban state. In November, a number of their members went on hunger strike. Their headquarters, which is the home of the main leader of the organization, was raided by Cuban officials. And that led to a really unprecedented gathering of Cuban artists and intellectuals in front of the Ministry of Culture over a number of hours, demanding to speak with the Minister of Culture about the state's treatment of these artists. And what was unique about that moment was that the artists gathering in front of the Ministry of Culture didn't necessarily agree with the San Isidro movement's tactics or its political message or things like that, but they were demanding greater freedom of expression and respect for certain basic rights, right? So since then, there has been a kind of ongoing tit for tat between members of the movement, other members of civil society, and distinct organs of the Cuban state. And so the moment it's a moment of great tension, I would argue, between the Cuban state and certainly one sector, if you will, of Cuban civil society. So, in the context of this party Congress, that gives this message of sort of continuity and an insistence on sort of loyalty to the kind of political imaginary of the Cuban state and the Cuban Revolution. Just another sort of resonance point, I suppose, right? There were a number of moments in the party Congress where Cuban officials speaking, including Miguel Díaz-Canel, appeared quite clearly to allude to some of these recent events, if not to the San Isidro movement itself, indicating that the Cuban government's tolerance would be limited. Certainly that sector of Cuban civil society that sympathizes with the San Isidro movement, read pretty clearly between the lines in terms of the message that was being sent.
So a lot going on and a very tense moment on the island politically, as you put it. But I want to go back to what you said about the economic situation and the impact of Trump's sanctions that he imposed over the course of 4 years, and even at the very end of his administration, relisting Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, which was a designation that had been lifted under President Obama. When Biden was elected president in November, the mood in Cuba was largely celebratory, and I don't think many people expected an immediate return to the Obama era. But there was still an expectation, I think it's fair to say, that Biden would quickly reverse some of Trump's more damaging policies. How would you say the first few months of the new administration have been received in Havana?
I think in Havana, there's a great deal of disappointment. And when I say Havana, I'm referring, not just to, Cuba's foreign service or the Cuban government. I'm referring to society in general. Notwithstanding the great degree of tension that there is in Cuban society now, economically and politically, the vast majority of Cubans are still in agreement that U.S. policies make their lives worse and don't make their lives better, right? So there has been, I think, universal disappointment. On the one hand, some of the expectations in the wake of the Biden election that snap your fingers and we'll get back to where we were in the Obama era, those were overblown all along. And it was one thing that I was actually trying to, a message I was trying to telegraph myself on Twitter and in certain pieces I wrote, because, this is a different moment than 2014. If the policy arguments for doing what Obama did are largely still in place, and I believe that they are, I think they're all valid. The political circumstances regionally and in Cuba and in the U.S.-Cuban relationship are different, and in South Florida too. And of course, U.S.-Cuba policy is, unfortunately, I would argue, a domestic political issue in the United States because it has to do, it gets into calculations of Florida's electoral politics. So I wasn't, particularly bullish that the Biden administration would move right away to undo everything that Trump did. I knew, I think as many did, that the Biden administration was going to inherit a world of problems, abroad and at home. The domestic agenda was always going to take priority. COVID was going to take priority, right? And so Cuba was never going to be a priority. But I did have hope that what were the basic elements of Biden's campaign promise, that I'm going to get rid of some of the more noxious restrictions on the ability of Cubans to send money to their families or to travel to certain parts of the island, or Americans to travel to certain parts of the island, that those things would be lifted, because those are the things that have done most direct humanitarian damage to individual Cubans, right? Those are the things that the entire U.S. policy does this, but those things in particular make average Cubans collateral damage of a disagreement between two governments, right? And unfortunately, the Biden administration has been very slow to move. And if they have indicated anything, they have indicated that the policy is under review. But the message coming out of the White House, and not so much from the press secretary, from the people that are working on Latin America policy, has been, we're not in any hurry, and frankly, that's disappointing, because the more time passes, the more that effectively the Biden administration is communicating to Cuba, to Cubans, and to the region that they're happy having the Trump administration's policy be their own. So, I'm hopeful that we'll see movement at some point over the next year, but it's frankly moving a lot slower than I thought and that I hoped.
One of the people who was disappointed was Ben Rhodes, the former foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama, who famously helped engineer the detente with Cuba by conducting secret negotiations with the Cubans in the lead up to the announcement that they would try to normalize relations in 2014. He tweeted a couple weeks ago that so far Biden has been completely indistinguishable from Trump on Cuba policy and messaging. That's a pretty scathing statement.
Yeah, and it's one with which I largely agree. I mean, I think there are some differences in rhetoric that you can point to. I mean, the Biden administration hasn't been talking about a troika of tyranny, and they haven't sort of adopted as their own the language of a maximum pressure campaign. But their own talking points on Cuba are quickly becoming pretty stale, short of action. Their talking points have been consistently, particularly coming out of the NSC, we will empower the Cuban people. And we believe that Americans and Cuban Americans in particular are the best ambassadors of U.S. values. These are talking points that in some respects harken back to the Obama policy. They were kind of also used then. But again, short of action to undo the most intense sort of sanctions on Cuba that we've seen in decades, this is sort of empty rhetoric. I say that as somebody who is quite clear-minded about the shortcomings of the Cuban government in all kinds of areas, right? I think what Ben Rhodes would argue, and what I would agree with, is that the United States should act in its own national interest, and that if there is a concern that the U.S. moving sends a bad signal, or is the timing's bad vis-a-vis some of this kind of internal tension that's happening inside Cuba, and that sending American travelers down there again would just sort of bail out the system. That's a very misguided way of seeing it, right? There's nothing about allowing Cuban Americans to send money to their family, or allowing Cuban Americans and Americans to travel to the island that directly impedes the work of members of Cuban civil society, right? In fact, I would challenge anyone to point at evidence to me that that the sanctions imposed by the Trump administration made the work of Cuban civil society easier or made it more successful. They didn't, right? And that's because events inside Cuba don't revolve strictly around USCuban policy. That's we need to get over our own egocentrism in that respect, right? Cuba is much more than its relationship with the United States. And in my view, the more that the relationship with the United States is sort of stops becoming the boogeyman of Cuba's internal politics, the more likely it is that Cubans themselves can have the conversations amongst them that they want to have and define the future that they want to see.
Just to drill down a little bit on those talking points you mentioned from the White House about the Biden administration's Cuba policy, there was an interview that Juan S Gonzalez, the National Security Council's senior director for the Western Hemisphere, did last week with the Miami Herald, in which he said that the Biden administration has, quote, no major urgency to invest a lot of time on Cuba unless we see concrete things on the island. What do you think those concrete things are in this case?
I think you'd have to ask Juan Gonzalez to specify. What I can say is that while I certainly understand that, and to a point I'm sympathetic, right, to the idea that Cuba is not necessarily the first item on the White House's foreign policy agenda, let alone its U.S.-Latin American relations agenda. That kind of statement, that we have no particular urgency, in the ears of the Cuban people who may read it, is quite callous sounding, and it's quite callous because Cuba again is in the midst of its worst crisis in 30 years, right? Crises that in the crisis of this scale in the past have led to mass migration moments. I'm not saying we're there yet, but this is a very difficult moment in Cuba. Make no mistake. And again, I would never argue that economic or other problems in Cuba are the responsibility of the U.S. government alone. They're not. Cuban economists don't even argue that, right? But it is absolutely the case that the kind of sanctions that were put in place by the Trump administration, again, make average Cubans collateral damage, and make their lives more difficult, and they have in all kinds of ways, right? I was disappointed by that statement. In terms of developments that they may want to see, it's interesting. I mean, I think, of course, a White House would welcome signs of a government opening to greater political pluralism, for some of the reasons that I already mentioned. That isn't in the offing in the short term. In terms of other signs, though, it's interesting. If we think back to the Obama administration, one of the things that kind of made it politically possible for them to move on Cuba was that, notwithstanding a fair amount of political continuity even then, there was after 2010 fairly significant moves toward economic reform on the island. The talk of those economic reforms ended up being more ambitious than what was implemented. But nonetheless, that we saw starting about 10 years ago, a pretty significant expansion of Cuba's private sector. And what's interesting about this moment is that if it's true that fast forward to 2016, the Cuban state appeared to kind of get nervous about the expansion of the private sector and kind of move away from that again. What's interesting about now is that the COVID crisis, right, because of its effects on the economy, has forced the government's hand again. And back in July of 2020, they started announcing that they were going to move forward on economic reforms again. So, freeing up even more space for the private sector, legalizing small and medium-sized enterprises, and moving forward finally on this very difficult but necessary process of currency unification. A lot of those things are really still germinal. The currency unification process started in January. Private sector expansion is still, to be seen. But the government has committed to those things. And when at the time that they made those announcements, there was even some commentary that these are winks, so to speak, to the Biden campaign, right? So I think to the extent that the Cuban state follows through on some of these things on the economic front, you could make an argument that those are very significant changes. And one of the things I would note as a kind of tension or contradiction in this party Congress that just happened, as much as there was this insistence on continuity, and sort of the historical imaginary of the Cuban Revolution and the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs and a kind of statement of ideological principles vis-a-vis determined opposition to U.S. interference in Cuban affairs, there was also a lot of talk of economic reform, right? And some of the old guard voices in the party that everyone has long suspected as being sort of among those resisting further move toward market liberalization, those guys are now retired, right? So, arguably there are some very significant things happening on the economic front at the same time that there is this moment of political retrenchment. That may not be enough to get us back to the Obama policy, even if you can argue on merit that the United States should go there anyway. But I would hope that, again, to the extent that the Cuban state follows through on some of those economic reforms, that creates an opportunity for the White House to think about how to work collaboratively with the Cuban people and with Cuba's private sector to facilitate some of those processes, or at least not get in their way in the way that U.S. sanctions are currently.
Yeah, the economic piece is very interesting because I even remember, I was in D.C. in my previous life as a news producer and reporter covering the Obama administration's opening with Cuba. And it seemed like at the time, a week wouldn't go by without some industry association or some lobbying group holding an event talking about how excited they are about the opportunities in Cuba. The agricultural lobby was all for it. The tourism industry obviously was super excited. There were all sorts of there was all sorts of talk about economic opportunities for American businesses in Cuba, new investment opportunities. I wonder if there might be room for that kind of mobilization, which was also working to influence members of Congress, for instance. But I wonder if there's room for something like that to happen now to provide a boost to the Biden administration.
Perhaps. I think one of the things that happened in the Obama years was, the opening came with such hype. And hype always is just that. It ends up being sort of overinflated and a little bit out of step with reality in one way or another. And one of the ways in which it was out of step with reality is that, you saw, junket after junket of, as you said, businesses, commercial associations, legislators kind of going down to Cuba, talking about, business opportunities. I think we have to distinguish between folks who were really serious about it, on the U.S. side, that is, and really kind of had a sense of what they might be getting into in terms of the state of the Cuban economy and the way that joint investments work. And it should be noted, the Obama administration didn't lift the embargo, right? It created sort of new holes in the embargo that made some investment possibilities legal. And those authorizations are technically still on the books, by the way. But it wasn't as if the sort of the flood was totally happening. Nor, frankly, was the Cuban state prepared for the onslaught, right? And they were dealing with an onslaught of U.S. visitors, some of whom were serious, others of which were let's be honest, probably just there to get to Cuba to say I went to Cuba. There was a little bit of that, the sort of hype and frankly, probably being quite arrogant about, when they went down about their ideas about, what they thought might be possible. So, all of that said, I think unmistakably there was a missed opportunity, right? The amount of sort of U.S. Cuba business that was solidified in those, again, brief, 2-year period. So we can't exactly expect the world of just a 2-year period compared to 50 plus years prior. But the amount of U.S. Cuba business that was actually sort of signed on the dotted line was really quite limited in scope. It involved airlines, it involved the cruise ships, but in terms of like actual investment on the ground, very, very few. There are even a few cases of notable offers being rebuffed on the Cuban side. And I think the Cuban side had the sense that, well, look, Obama has turned the corner. U.S. policy can't go back. No one saw Trump getting elected. And so the Cuban state thought that they had time, right, to sort of slow roll this, because this is also, remember, one of the things that the Cuban government did in 1960, 61 was nationalize U.S. properties because there was a sense that U.S. investors had an overbearing degree of influence in the Cuban economy prior to that point. So if your message is continuity, all of a sudden opening the doors for U.S. investors, symbolically is quite a difficult needle to thread. But there was a missed opportunity because I think if you had more of that business solidified, it would have been more difficult to unwind what the Obama administration had achieved. The extent to which, if the Cuban government gives signals that they're really willing to play ball with potential U.S. investors again, whether that could help sort of create momentum on the U.S. side, I think unquestionably. My question is, to what extent has the U.S. business world moved on, right, and said, well, that didn't work, and that's unfortunate because again, it's a very short term mentality, but that would be one concern I have. Can lightning strike twice? I frankly don't know.
You alluded earlier in the conversation to changes that had taken place in the region, in Cuba, in South Florida, between 2014 and now. Can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe give some examples of what some of the more important changes are that are hindering the return to an Obama-like détente with Cuba?
Yeah, let me start with the regional piece first. Another of the factors that made the Obama administration's policy possible, and in fact pushed the Obama administration to act, was that all of Latin America was telling the Obama administration that they had to do it, right? You may remember sort of a series of summits of the Americas kind of leading up to 2014 in which, the region was united as one voice in saying, either you, the United States, fix your relationship with Cuba, or at least get it to some kind of more rational, reasonable place, notwithstanding your significant differences, or else, the inter-American system, as you understand it, right, as one that is not just about Latin America, but is about uniting North and Latin America, ceases to have a certain amount of interest for us, right, and so that in many respects was among the factors driving the Obama administration to act. If you fix the relationship with Cuba, you open the door to sort of resetting the relationship with Latin America, period. And that was important to do coming out of some of the legacies of the Bush administration previously. What's happened in recent years is that unified chorus in the region. It's not that all of a sudden there's a tremendous surge in support for U.S. sanctions, but politically, the pink tide, is on the ropes, to put it mildly. Right, a number of governments have been elected in the region that are openly conservative or right-leaning in orientation, and that has changed the kind of regional picture. It doesn't mean that left governments can't come back into power. Witness recent elections in a number of places where that have been quite competitive. Witness the re-arrival of the MAS in power in Bolivia as one example. But it means that I don't think you have this kind of unified regional voice, and particularly against the backdrop of a pandemic that is just doing such damage to the economic, social, and political fabric of the region in so many ways. I don't think you have, again, voices from the South pushing Washington to act on Cuba in the same way. In terms of the Florida piece, you know, I mean, it's a longer conversation, but in a nutshell, if you look at the election results in 2020, Trump increased his support among not just Cuban Americans in South Florida, but even more so among non-Cuban Latinos in South Florida. Right, this branding of Biden as a socialist appeared to work in a climate of just unprecedented amounts of disinformation, particularly in Spanish language media. And so that has led some to argue that for the Biden administration to sort of get back on the Obama train in terms of U.S.-Cuba policy, that it's political suicide. In fact, that's what Andres Oppenheimer recently argued in that column where he interviewed Juan Gonzalez. I strongly disagree with that. I think that's a cop out, because the reasons that the Biden administration did so poorly, or the Biden campaign, forgive me, did so poorly in South Florida, is really not centrally about Cuba policy. I'm not going to argue that it wasn't part of the picture. There has been an evolution of Cuban American sentiment on U.S.-Cuba policy, right? But that is the product of the fact that the Obama administration, I think in retrospect, didn't do a good enough job sort of doing retail politics in South Florida to defend the policy and to point out the ways that it was making the lives of the Cuban people better. And it has to do with the fact that from the time that Trump came into office, he or high-level emissaries of his administration were in Miami on a regular basis, sort of pounding home the message that the Cuba deal had failed, that Biden was a socialist, et cetera, et cetera. And when you think about that against the backdrop of the slow pace of reforms politically and economically inside Cuba, the kind of way that the expectations inside Cuba coming out of the Obama moment seemed to become deflated, it created an environment in which, people were gravitating back to this kind of hardline message. But that's a reflection of leadership kind of taking public opinion with it, right? We saw under Obama that Obama was actually able to bring Cuban American community sentiment around U.S.-Cuba policy toward his position in a significant way. Right. Notwithstanding what I just argued, the sort of relative weakness of their effort to sort of do the retail politics in Miami. I just think that the argument that, touching Cuba policy at all is political suicide, I think is a really superficial argument. It's a cop out from looking at the real failures of the Democratic Party to engage with the Latino electorate in South Florida, period. And poll after poll shows that if it is true that Cuban American opinion has shifted on things like the embargo, when you ask Cuban American voters what's the most sort of important thing that guides their vote, Cuba policy is last on the list, right? So I do think there's an opportunity to make a political argument by, why a new approach is needed, and frankly would be more humanitarian. But I fear that this domestic political argument will win the day, even though I think it's an erroneous one or a simplified one.
Right. It did seem like during the Obama administration, there was this consistent message of generational change, even in the Cuban American community, where younger voters, younger politically minded sons and daughters of people who might have fled Cuba as exiles are feeling differently about Cuba than the older generations might.
Yeah, and that still remains the case to a significant degree, right? Where the real shift has been among Cuban migrants who have come to this country since the mid '90s. Which, granted, that's a long period of time, but that's for good or for ill is kind of how we tend to sort of think about our cohorts in the Cuban migrant community. But that community of not necessarily younger, because they run the age gamut, but more recent Cuban migrants, that's where we've seen opinion really change. Under Obama and leading up to Obama, this was the cohort of the community that was most in favor of doing something different. It was the cohort of the community that most took advantage of the ability to kind of go back and forth to Cuba with greater ease, send money there, even kind of invest under the table in ways that were illegal from the point of view of the Cuban state, but they were doing it. And their rising frustrations with the slowness of reform in multiple dimensions in Cuba has been one of the things that has propelled a shift back or a resurgence of hardline attitudes among this more recent cohort of Cuban migrants that and who as time passes are increasingly becoming voters, right? And so that's really the big change, right? If you look at in a detailed way at the data, the shift in opinion among U.S. born Cuban Americans is much less, and those folks tend to lean more Democrat and tend to lean more in favor of opening U.S. policy opening to Cuba. It's among that more recent cohort that we've seen the biggest change, and so there's a lot of I think there's a lot of responsibility to go around. There's the insufficiency of reform inside Cuba that has had a kind of radicalizing effect on them, and also again the failure of the efforts of the Democratic Party to figure out how to get at that demographic. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how poor and how late the outreach was in terms of the Biden campaign. And this is a cohort, by the way, just to think about some of the contradictions, right? They may be hardline on Cuba policy, but these are the folks that have some of the highest percentages of Obamacare enrollment in the country, right? Not too long ago, I rolled past a storefront of an mom and pop insurance agency in Miami that had literally, it said they were selling Obamacare, had a giant portrait of both Obama and Trump side by side. Right, as if Trump is somehow responsible and can now take credit for this insurance that's available to these folks, right? So it speaks a little bit to the wacky world of politics here in South Florida, but that's the world that we're in.
So it seems like now the relationship is stuck. There's mismatched expectations. There's a sense of disappointment, maybe on both sides. What do you think it might take to get the relationship back toward a more forward-looking orientation, or are we just kind of destined to be in this sort of rut for the next however many months or years?
Gosh, if I had a crystal ball, right? My instinct tells me that given the vulnerability that the Cuban state feels at this moment, vis-a-vis the scale of the economic crisis, vis-a-vis the kind of ferment in society, I wouldn't expect, and it's just out of character. It hasn't happened in 60 years. I don't see it happening now. The Cuban state to sort of unilaterally make some, grand gesture of political opening or economic opening beyond what they've already sort of set in motion. I think the United States the U.S. government, the Biden administration needs to think long and hard about U.S. national interests and how you do the least harm. For all that one can criticize the Cuban government, right now, U.S. policy is making the lives of the Cuban people worse. It has for 60 years, but I would argue particularly over the last 4. I mean, the idea that, as just one example, if someone in the Cuban government wanted to import some kind of medical products from a U.S. company in the context of the pandemic, which is technically allowed under exceptions to the embargo, right? But the idea that you have to go through this complicated licensing process for that makes it so that U.S. companies don't even want to bother, right? Like there's no good political or let alone humanitarian argument for doing that, right? So I think the United States, the idea that you can, the United States shouldn't move at all, and that unilateral action without any kind of direct concession from the Cuban government is weakness. I don't buy it. The United States needs to act in its own national interest and how it can best improve the lives of the Cuban people. What I would say is that the Cuban government, it takes two. The Cuban government can help its case. And if the Cuban government, at least on the economic front, really moves forward in a sort of decisive way with the economic reforms that they have said that they were going to do, not because the United States is telling them to do it, but because they got to do it, that I would hope would create some momentum for change. But right now the political environment in Cuba is one of significant polarization that is not conducive to sending necessarily the kind of political signals that might prompt the Biden administration to act. I hope the Biden administration can see through that fog and do what's right, do what's in U.S. interests, and what stands the greatest chance of improving the lives of the Cuban people over the short and long term.
Michael, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Michael Bustamante is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Florida International University. His latest book is Cuban Memory Wars: Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T, and Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.